What if the future of business wasn't just about profit, but about purpose? Right now, we're witnessing a massive shift in how organizations create impact. Social enterprises are rewriting the rules, combining profit with purpose, and it's not just a trend, it's becoming the new standard. Today, we're diving into social enterprise for research impact with Tom Dawkins, exploring how this powerful model can transform the way we think about creating change and why it matters for all of us.
What I really want to kind of do over the next 45, 50 minutes is try and explain what's going on right now. What are these things that people call social enterprises? Why are they growing so fast right now? And why does that matter for all of us? And so what is a social enterprise? Part of what's confusing about social enterprise is people do mean it to mean a variety of different things. As you can see on this graph, people can use, depending on who you're talking to, people will use the phrase social enterprise to mean a variety of different types, whether that's a for-profit business which contributes to charitable spend, or a business owned by a charity, or an enterprise with a charity conducting some trading activities, or an enterprise with a clear social mission or purpose. And what we would say at Starts and Good is that, yes, these are all social enterprises. Different organizations play a different role in the sector, and one of those roles is certification. So there are organizations out there in Australia and globally whose job is to draw a very specific line. That's not our job at Starts and Good, to be honest. Our job is to do what I'm doing now, is to try and explain to people what's going on and hopefully get you excited about how you can get involved. We want to get people on the journey. And so viewed at that bigger level, it's important to understand that social enterprise is not a thing you are, it's a thing you do. There is in Australia and in most countries no social enterprise legal structure. You can't just set up a social enterprise in the way that you can set up a business, set up a charity. What you would need to do to create a social enterprise is to set up one of those existing legal structures, set up a business, set up a charity, set up a cooperative, and then that organization does social enterprise. Fundamentally, it's when you do two things that traditionally have been bifurcated together, which is focus on a balance of private and communal benefits, profit and purpose. Now, sometimes when I explain this to people, I get some pushback where they say, I don't really care about the profit. We're doing social enterprise, we give all our profits away. Well, that's fine, but there's still private benefits involved there. A question I like to ask, do you want to make this your day job? Do you want to do social change as just a volunteer? Or do you want to make it a core part of your work? If you want to make it a core part of your work, that's a type of private benefit, to receive the kind of salary and conditions that you absolutely deserve or are seeking, not for me to judge one way or another. But the point being for you to find, it's a space within which we look to create balance. That's true on the founder side, as I just said, that balance of the private benefits that come from salaries or equity ownership, possible future wealth, along with having a clear impact model that drives change. It's true, of course, at every level. It's true for consumers as well. Most social enterprises to succeed requires that there's a buyer who also cares about those two things. It's really important to understand they will still care very deeply about solving their personal problem, whatever that is, getting their private benefit from the product or service that they're purchasing, but they will hopefully also be considering the wider impact of that choice, the communal benefits or the biosphere benefits from doing that. And so what this allows us to do is two things that used to be very separated. The old school vision of business and work is it's just about you, getting what you need, and then people do community outside of work hours on the week. They might participate in a church community or a nonprofit, go to meetings, union meetings in the evenings, or participate in a cleanup on the weekend. But all those things were separated. And social enterprise is about, can we bring them together? And so I want to talk about kind of how we bring them together. Now, depending on who you ask, that means there are kind of two really key must-haves. One is you must be doing impact. You must be doing the social piece. So you must be able to articulate a clear social and environmental impact model. And then you must be actually trading. So not relying on donations, government subsidy, etc., to allow you to pursue or implement that social and environmental impact model, but rather to be sustaining it through trade, which is to say to be selling a product or service to a willing buyer. Now, there are many hybrids. Generally, those in the business of drawing clear lines will say that to be considered a social enterprise, you must be earning at least half or the majority of your income from trading. So there may still be a role, and there must be a role in many models for government subsidy, but the majority of your income, you want to come from the product or the service that you're actually delivering. Just to quote, I'm in New South Wales, and so our state peak body is basically a peak body in every state and territory in Australia now, gathering together the people running or trying to create or interested in social enterprises. In New South Wales, that's SECNA, the Social Enterprise Council of New South Wales, and the ACT, and they talk about three key things for them. A social enterprise is a business for good. They trade like any other business. Let's say you're competing in a marketplace. Our product or service is better, more affordable, delivers more value. That's why you should buy it. It's also better for the world, but exists to make the world a better place. To have a social, cultural, or environmental purpose, generate a substantial portion of their income from trade, and invest profit and resources into their purpose so that public community benefit outweighs private benefit. And so that's a common line as well amongst those who do certifying work or approve, is this or is this not a social enterprise? Is that balance of public and community benefit versus private benefit. That's why if your impact model is giving profits away, the line for most people is you must be giving away at least half of it. At least balancing that, one for the world, one for private owners at a minimum, and some that you may be familiar with that even give about 100% away. So let's talk about where the rubber meets the road. In terms of, at Start Some Good, we've hosted probably about 50 accelerator and the pre-accelerator programs over the last 10 years for people developing, designing, launching, growing social enterprises. And we've developed a bit of our own taxonomy as to kind of how do impact models meet business models practically. We think there's essentially 6 types or 7 types within 2 core genres. The first is what we call redistributive impact models. One way to think about that is they're the most traditional type of businesses. They have to really just compete in the market like others, but then the impact is created through what they do with the surplus created. And the second is embedded impact. There, the impact is not about what is done with the surplus, but how the business is run. It's embedded within the core operations of the business, so that by the time profit is made or even not, the impact's already been created. It doesn't rely on profits to then be invested into impact. The impact is actually there in the business along the way. Another way to think about this is above or below profits. Embedded impact is above profits. So the business may only be break even. It may even be structurally loss-making and require an ongoing philanthropic subsidy. That may still be a good deal that philanthropists are willing to make if they're convinced that the impact that's been created along the way is significant enough. Redistributed is downstream of profits. If you're not making a profit, you have nothing to distribute. You must run at a surplus. So within redistributed, there's 2 main things that get redistributed. One is profit and the other is goods and services. So profit is, we give 50% of our profits to causes. We give 100% of our profit to causes. Goods is usually some version of buy one, give one as a model. We sell one, we're able to give one away. Or on the services side, we do a commercial project and we're able to do a subsidized concessionary project. And then in terms of embedded impact, there's 4 main ways in which we see that impact get embedded. The first is in who gets the jobs that are created. Now, jobs are always a social good in a way. Employment's really important. But here we really mean specifically addressing the exclusion of a particular population from employment opportunities. That could be homeless young people, ex-prisoners, refugees or migrants whose qualifications are recognized, people in far remote communities with almost no employment options, and so on, who gets to benefit from that growing business in terms of employment and opportunities to do work. The second is access. That's often about redesigning. Sometimes it's about delivery mechanisms, sometimes about pricing, but it's giving people access to something that they've traditionally been excluded from. Sometimes it's redesigning what that product looks like, but essentially there's something beneficial like banking. A bit like 10 years ago, 1 billion people in Africa had no access to banking type services. Since then, there's been some really interesting social enterprises that have created access to banking type services, usually through mobiles. And then there's better for us, better for the world. And these are quite hard categories to measure, which is why they're often underrepresented in terms of those traditional certified social enterprises. It's really easy to kind of say, are you redistributing? Very easy to see or measure. Who do you employ? And even like, what's your pricing and delivery model and who's your customer base in terms of that beneficial population? When the products themselves are designed in a way that helps us be healthier or better for the world, how much better is better enough to now call yourself a social enterprise versus just a business that's doing good? It's hard to say. That's why we often don't see better for us is often, again, around product design and delivery. Better for the world is often about materials, things like circular economy. So I think in those spaces, you see a preponderance of for-profit companies who often are not certified social enterprises, but they might be in at something else like a B Corp, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then, of course, there's blended. There's social enterprises that are kind of bringing multiple of those together. One of the common mistakes I'll say that I sometimes see people do is they try to design an organization that does let all the good that it's possible to do right from day one by embedding and by kind of using a whole gamut of different impact models that they are going to give all their profits away, but they're also going to provide employment to disadvantaged populations. They're also going to offer a product that's priced in a way that creates access to people currently excluded. Simultaneously, they can try and make that product more highly sustainable. That's almost impossible to do. If you're both pursuing like a low pricing access, but also kind of high sustainability, those things might be at odds. It's hard if you're focused on employing people with a disadvantage, likely the additional costs of that's really important work, but the additional costs of that are likely to make it very hard for you to be profitable, if ever. So that is unlikely to be a meaningful impact model. But the attempt to do all of that is likely to drive you into the ground and make it very, very hard for you to succeed. Generally, there are some models that are very naturally blended and work beautifully together, such as giving access to a healthcare service. That's also better to us. We'd pick both of those. But for most, we would recommend having a very clear priority impact model initially, that we're about making profit so that we can give them away, or we're about employing people who need that opportunity, and working very hard to be great at that, because it's hard enough to be really great at, social enterprise is a funny thing because it's we need it. Business simply is such a big part of our lives. It's such a big part of the economy. So we need to turn those business activities towards good. But it's also an attempt to do two incredibly hard things simultaneously. Most fail. Equally, actually making a meaningful dent on the world and actually addressing a social issue at any kind of scale, or even just locally, is incredibly hard. Social enterprise is the brilliant idea that why don't we try these two incredibly hard things together? But when it does work, there is that power in one does power the other. So it does kind of combine these two problems in a way that doesn't necessarily make it harder than doing either of them individually, but may in fact create the right balance that makes it easier for you to devote your time to it by being able to build a revenue model that supports you, easier to find support through that. So I'm going to race through a bunch of examples here just to really illustrate these different models. But the famous redistributive model is probably Tom's, or the most famous globally. There's the shoe company. If they didn't invent it, they popularized the idea of one for one. In Australia, another example of that model is Hero Condoms. They also have a sister company called Her Tampons that sell condoms and tampons here and then give them away in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank You Water is a redistributive profit social enterprise. Who Gives a Crap, another famous example of that in Australia, who give 100% of their profits. And we've seen increasingly products pop up in all sorts of different consumer categories. Here's beer, the Great Barrier Beer. This is Good Brewing Company, rather, who launched through Start Some Good, a crowdfunding campaign initially, and each of their beers supports a different charity. This one, the Great Barrier Beer, supports I don't think it is actually the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, but one that works on the Great Barrier Reef. Salvo's Legal is a redistributive one as well. They're not actually a public interest law firm. They were a business law firm. So this is a B2B example, more in the services space, but which gave their profits to the Salvation Army. This has actually since wound down, which may speak to a little bit of the challenge here of the mismatch of brands that Salvo's are kind of associated, obviously, with kind of providing support to very poor families, but not a mark of necessarily, you don't think of them maybe as a quality brand mark, versus I think most people when they see this think that this would be a public interest law firm, but there's actually a business law firm, again, trying to compete in this competitive category where people don't want to give any breaks for your mission. It has to be, no one's going to sacrifice their own legal advice. No one wants B-grade legal advice just because the profits go to a good cause. This is an example where the product itself has to be 100% competitive with existing competitors, because it's not an area where you can expect anyone to give you a break, no matter how important your mission is, because the private benefits they need from the service is kind of unmoving. And then if you can win their trust on that, it gives a big opportunity to differentiate through mission. But you have to win at least parity on the core service proposition. Street is a well-known social enterprise cafe chain in Melbourne. This is an interesting example sometimes of where the way we talk about, we may simplify kind of the impact model for communication's sake in a way that doesn't line up directly with the real model. The truth is Street is not profitable and probably will never be profitable. They do the incredibly hard work of providing employment opportunities to homeless young people. That's why what they really mean by 100% of profit is 100% of everything. Well, that's what they do. They take on that very difficult work. But you can imagine it's the opposite of the kind of staffing model for most cafes. Most cafes, if they need a new barista, they're like, show me that you can make coffee. Tell me about the other cafes you've worked in. Street They only take people who are completely unemployable, have never had an employment opportunity, are living on the streets. And if you want to give those people a life-changing opportunity, it's not enough to just give them a job. You need to take care of those other elements as well. It's going to be very difficult for someone to hold, to be a reliable staff member turning up and opening the cafe if they don't have a safe place to sleep. The costs of all of that versus the low traditional profit margin of a cafe anyway, make it pretty much impossible to run an employment-oriented cafe in a profitable way. So you do need that. This street is structured as a charity and has philanthropic support. But it's worth it to the philanthropist because it's still a very efficient way and it solves the key problem, which is getting these. You could provide a lot of non-profit funded training, capacity building support and other services, but getting them into employment is still the hardest step. And so by combining those things together inside Street, by both doing the wraparound support, but also actually getting them into a job, supporting them through those growing pains, and then when they're ready, moving them on into the rest of the economy so that they can do it again, still creates a highly efficient impact model, but not one that is likely to kind of scale or be profitable in traditional business terms. There's a great social enterprise in Sydney called the Social Outfit, and they have two impact models. They'd use recycled or waste stock that would otherwise be thrown out from fashion brands, and the clothes are made in Sydney by refugee women. So made ethically, made sustainably, made local. And I really love this. They did a lot of work to try and unify. I think often with social enterprises, very simple, clear communication can be hard with those different elements. Their clothes themselves are also very bold and bright, and they mostly appear to professional women, successful women, female founders, journalists, politicians. And so after a lot of it, they came up with a slogan that really does unify all of that in a way that I think is fantastic and kind of rare. Fashion that empowers women. It's both the style of their fashion and who is their actual buyer. But of course, the jobs that it creates also empowers women who really struggle, to get settled and find employment in their new homeland. And then I think the sustainability element, less prioritized there, but that's something that's also going on in the background and obviously gets a mention in the strap line, made sustainably. Once again, though, they're structured as a charity. And so they're about 50-50, last I heard, in terms of sales plus philanthropy. So that's almost always the case in these employment social enterprises. Maybe the one place that has some exceptions to that is around neurodiversity and tech skills. One of the structural challenges against employment social enterprises, generally the places where you can create an employment opportunity are lower skilled, a lower barrier to entry jobs, but they tend to also get paid less and they tend to be in industries with a lower profit margin. And therefore it's hard to absorb the additional costs of providing the additional support and wraparound services required. The one place that might be around helping people with neurodiversity into tech jobs, because those are actually jobs that are very high skilled, highly paid, highly valuable, and where tech companies already pay huge amounts to recruiters to help provide them with talent. And so that's the kind of stuff that Exception will do, is providing that pathway into mainstream employment. Access enterprises, as I said, give people access to something that they otherwise can't afford or access. This is an example of a speech therapy app in the US. Speech therapy is very expensive. This is specifically for people with a stutter. So people with a severe stutter from a low socioeconomic background usually don't get access to speech therapy. And as a result, having a severe stutter has a significant negative impact on your educational attainment, employment prospects, etc., and ultimately, life satisfaction and success. That's access. Here's an example of the mobile banking that I've mentioned. M-Pesa has made an absolutely massive impact in Africa by providing people access to essentially banking infrastructure, a place to store credit, a place to transfer credit. But instead of using traditional banking infrastructure, they're using mobile infrastructure. People are now transferring $2 billion a month through M-Pesa. Umbo is an online speech therapy platform providing a traditional service by using Zoom, online platform, and so on. But it's not just online and tech. Ability Made use 3D printing and scanning to create much lower cost, faster orthotics for kids who needs them, kids with cerebral palsy, also kids who might have stepped on a landmine in Southeast Asia. And by using those technologies, they've brought down the cost by a factor of about 10, which gives people access to those who wouldn't otherwise have it. And that can be life-changing. Finnings, even perhaps the most traditional social enterprise we could think of, might also be an example of this, because part of their impact model is giving low-income households access to quality second-hand goods that have been vetted, where the lights are certain to work and not set your house on fire and things like that. So there's an access element to that, as well as, of course, a sustainability element, circular economy. Also redistributive. It funds the work of their parent organization St. Vincent de Paul's. So they've got 3 impact models actually within that one. Seaweedery is a startup social enterprise we've worked with. They make prawn oils from what would have otherwise been the discarded parts of the prawn catch. So the shells and so on. So that's circular economy, turning waste into value. As is Oceans and Bikinis. They make all their swimwear from plastics recovered from the oceans. And my final example of good for the planet that I love is a Good Eddie, which is edible coffee cups. So reducing that massive waste stream that is coffee cups, but without making some of us sacrifice our caffeine addiction. They've actually made the cup itself not only biodegradable. If you don't want to eat it, you just throw it away. It's food. It'll just obviously biodegrade, but you can actually eat it. It tastes a little like oat kind of a biscuit muesli type thing. And of course, the whole area of kind of health food, redesigning foods to be healthier traditionally, which is what Hampton Creek, now called Just, do. Well, finally, I want to give a B2B example, Neighborlytics, which is lifestyle insights for any location. This is data and visibility for developers and local government to help with the design of better communities. And this is, again, giving access to something that used to be incredibly inaccessible, this kind of quality data, or very expensive. So Neighborlytics grew out of a lot of research around placemaking and, finding the different data streams and what sort of data had what sort of inferences, and a huge amount of data analysis and interpretation these days. All of that, of course, is social science research, as well as providing data for future social science research baked into a product. So it's not just analysis, it's actually, let's keep doing this, not just a one-off research report, but actually a process to constantly surface key information. You can see the food innovation also comes from research and tech, all of these, of course, are ideas. And at the end of the day, social science research is so important because it's about people and how they behave, what they want, and how they get what they want. And that's at the core of most successful products. So another key product that grew out of a research project is Health, which was a monitoring device that you can see they're stuck on the wall. They discovered that one of the most predictive things for old people and behavior is the kettle, because they tend to have cups of tea at very predictable times. The TV can also serve that with a very predictable behavior, often around TV consumption. But these things can be a very low cost trigger for alerts pertaining to unusual behavior, falls, and things like that. This was a productized research project as well. I wanted to give an example of a blended one. This is a good one in Queensland. This is Substation 33. It's an e-waste recycling facility, so better for the world by preserving those resource streams. It creates employment for intellectually and physically disadvantaged and long-term unemployed people in the region, and has a parent organization that all the profits get redistributed to YFS. So, as I said, it's quite hard to say exactly how many social enterprises there are in Australia. There have been various attempts to estimate that. It's hard to do because you can't just look up how many of X are there, like how many charities are there. How many social enterprises? Hard to say. Depends what people are doing and why they're doing it. And they're spread across every type of organization: sole traders, for-profits, cooperatives, non-profits, community associations, registered charities. A report released 2 years ago by Social Enterprise Australia, maybe last year, estimated there were 12,000 social enterprises in Australia, contributing $21.3 billion to the Australian economy, which accounts for 1% of GDP, and employing as many people as are currently employed in arts and recreation services or the mining industry. About 1.6% of the workforce, 5% of the workforce, because of all those employment social enterprises. I mentioned B Corp earlier. It's an adjacent concept. It's a third-party standard that looks at the kind of real-world impact, less about kind of your corporate model, and more about kind of everything around that. Does the company make donations? Do they provide a staff volunteering day? What's the gender mix of their board? What's the gap between the highest and lowest paid person? Do they have a supplier diversity policy? And so on. With a goal that if you can achieve 80 points out of a possible 200, you can be certified as a B Corp, that you are operating as an ethical company. And this is where you see more and more big brands. And why are they doing this? Because there's a demand from consumers who are looking for businesses that are providing what they need, but are doing so in a way that is cognizant of and supporting the kind of future that they want to see as well. So there are some B Corps that are also social, and start to consider, whereas we consider ourselves social enterprise, we only do social impact education and support for social entrepreneurs, but we're also a registered B Corp, one of the first in Australia. So there are some that are overlapping, but many of these are not, most people wouldn't think as a social enterprise exactly, but they are seeking to use business as a force for good. And of course, they want to communicate that fact. So however you look at it, something's going on. There's more and more of these. B Corp is growing incredibly quickly. There's now, I forget the number, but many thousands around the world. The number of social enterprises increasing, the constant mentions, demands for impact investments, and all sorts of things. So why is that happening? Is a question that I want to ask and that I assume that you'll be interested in as researchers and academics. And this is a bit of my theory as to why that's going on. I think there's two big shifts that are driving this. And the first is what I call a shift from legacy to alignment. And it's a shift in how most of us think about change making, especially anyone, say, younger than me. I remember when I was a baby social entrepreneur and founding some of my early organizations at university, which were youth organizations, and I was consuming a lot of literature about how young people are engaging in politics and social change. One of the things that was identified at that point was that young people were doing less of what my parents did, which was really like lock into a couple of key organizations, become a member of a union or Amnesty member, go to write letters with a group every 2 weeks, etc. And rather they went project to project based on less kind of big picture being a unionist and more like a variety of factors that were focusing attention and that they wanted to be part of at the time. And this is kind of what I call alignment, which is more people thinking about the everyday, less what do I just want to like leave behind at the end, and more what are my decisions today? What do I want to do today? What do I want to be part of today? And then living in alignment of that. And that, I think, counterintuitively is triggered by what feels like an opposing force, which is the increasing speed of change. Now, everything feels like it's speeding up, world population, the amount of data being shared, the accelerating growth of technology. But I actually think it's had this counterintuitive impact, which is that it's demystified change. Back before this upswing, change wasn't really something people thought about, experienced, or really believed in, because in many parts of the world, it didn't happen at the speed of even a generation. If you were born in a French village in the 12th century and your dad was a blacksmith, there was a really high likelihood that you were just going to be a blacksmith in that village, or maybe the adjacent one. If you were a girl, your parents were going to choose who you were going to marry, and you would probably never go further than 10 miles from the place in which you were born. And so change just wasn't really a concept. To the extent there was change, it was something that, great people of history did. People over there, the prophets, revolutionaries, emperors, conquerors, and so on. But when it happens on a generation, a kingdom is overthrown, a new religion emerges, then it can only be those great people who trigger that. But when change instead becomes something that we are just all familiar with, that becomes, we are the fish and it is now the water. We don't know, I think young people today don't grow up expecting to have one job or to work in one industry. They know that things are going to change as they go. They don't expect any one technology to remain the one technology for the rest of their lives. Change is something that has gone from something people barely believed in to taken for granted in the blink of an eye. And this constant pace of change has done, two things. One is I think it gives rise to a greater imperative that we have to innovate. Again, when we know that things change constantly, well, then we also should know that the things that work today, if they even work, most things don't work. But even if they do work today, they're not going to work tomorrow because the conditions are going to change around it. Social good and social impact needs to constantly evolve as well. And that constant evolution gives rise for more and more people to bring forth their ideas as to what needs to change and how it can change. But it's also changed our relationship with that change around us. Most people went from believing that the future was going to be the same as the past. Then we went to believing that it doesn't just happen, it's shaped by decisions, but decisions out there, by decisions by great people, not by us. Whereas now we realize that it's shaped by my decisions, our decisions. It matters who we choose to buy from. It matters how we show up, who we vote for. We see these big changes, scary changes often as well for a lot of people, but happening all the time. And so it's totally demystified. It's just a thing that happens now. And therefore, it's just a thing that we can all be part of. And that's really different from how it used to be when it was more focused on legacy. When I think about legacy, that's really been the underpinning model for traditional philanthropy. And I think one of the best examples of that is this guy. If I had more time to do more interaction, I'd ask you, who is this? And it's always very funny what kind of guesses I get, ranging from my grandfather to all sorts of other, random figures, Henry Ford, kind of this uncertain kind of black and white bearded white men all look the same. There's something to that. This is actually, though, Alfred Nobel. And once I've revealed that, I'll tend to ask who here knows how he made his money. We now know him as, the name on the Nobel Peace Prize and so on. But how did he make his money so that he was able to endow this prize? And the answer that very few, it's rare that people know, but there's probably, a history professor watching this. I'm sure many of you do know, but the answer is dynamite. And so after the First World War, seeing the devastation that it wrought, I mean, he was in the mining industry, to be clear, not armaments, but it all instantly became, how we blew each other up in horrifying new ways. Felt bad about that and didn't want to be remembered as that, didn't want that to be his legacy of his family name, and so endowed the Nobel Peace Prize. And to me, it's one of the great examples of how kind of mind-bendingly kind of intuitive, the cognitive dissonance that you can sometimes encounter in philanthropy. That these days we give the world's greatest change makers the world's greatest peacemakers, but that's what legacy looks like. But thankfully, young people don't care about legacy, don't think about legacy in those terms anymore. The other thing that I've been hearing my whole life from back when I was a young whippersnapper, founding social impact organizations, but it's this sense of impatience that young people have. They don't want to wait. They don't want to wait to make a difference. They don't want to just do what they're told. They don't want to wait to the end of the life to leave a legacy. Instead, they want to think about who they are now and where they want to lend their support. And that's actually fantastic because the truth is all of us don't have time to wait anymore. The world needs urgency. The challenges before us are urgent and require focus now, not just later. We certainly don't have time for current generations, younger. We don't have time, let alone to wait for the generations behind us to retire, for them to retire and worry about their legacy and to give back then. We need action now. And so it's refreshing and encouraging to know that we're really seeing that. That you look at, you can look at many different reports, but all of them tend to share one core thing, which is younger generations, anyone below me, millennials and then Zs and so on, are increasingly likely to only want to purchase from companies that they see supporting causes or on the right side of causes they care about, and want to work for companies that have, that make a difference. It's not so long ago that we're all told that the only responsibility of business was to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rule of the game. What we've subsequently learned is that one of the things they use their resources and engage in activities to do is to change those rules of the game to benefit themselves. What's important for this presentation is to know that this classic 1970s conservative view of the role of business is disappearing almost completely. This was research into the beliefs about the role of business in society, millennials in the US, but I don't expect it to be very different here. It's a few years ago now. But essentially, only 7% of them at that time agreed with that premise that business only exists to be responsible to shareholders. The rest have some version of what we might call the stakeholder view of business rather than the shareholder primacy view, that they have at least some role in supporting social causes in the community around them. And fully 21% believe they should be redesigned to be social enterprises, essentially, that they should completely change the way they operate to redesign themselves around those social and environmental needs. And so that change in how we think about our values and our role and how we make an impact around us has coincided, the second big shift, with how we talk about the things that we care about. And it's a change in our media environment and how ideas travel from interruption to interaction. Back when I was in uni, I did a political science and history degree, but also did a couple of marketing classes here and there. And they used to talk about how the best marketing was word of mouth. And that was kind of true as far as it went. It was the best, but it wasn't actually what everyone focused on because it didn't scale. The greatest quantity of marketing was invested into interruption. And what interruption is when someone pays to interrupt when you're doing something else. You're watching the footy and someone pays to run an ad at you. You're trying to read the news in the newspaper. Someone pays to put an ad in there. You're hoping to get a postcard from a friend and someone pays to get junk mail into your letterbox. You're walking to the shops and someone in a koala costume asks you for a donation. All of those are interruption based. The thing about interruption is that it costs money. So a world that is focused on interruption is one that's biased towards the status quo, because the status quo has money and upstarts and challenges and different ways of doing business don't. But that's changed today because now word of mouth, peer-to-peer communications is not only the highest quality of possible idea spreading, it's also the highest quantity because we are connected together in ways that we never have before. There are 6 social networks around the world with over 1 billion users and growing. And so this interconnectedness has meant different types of ideas travel. Now, of course, interruption still plays a role. Brands still pay for advertising, but it's not the only game in town. There's a different pathway, one more suited often to social impact organizations. And that is sharing. And what gets shared on social media tends to be information, content that is timely, memorable, and trusted. That's what creates influence. And in this world, social enterprises have an inherent advantage because the stories they share are not just about products. They're about real world issues. They're about who you are. And that makes them more timely, more memorable, and more trusted. How many of you have ever kind of gone to the shops, bought toilet paper, brought it home, and thought to yourself, I better take a photo of this and share it with my friends? No one really does that, right? Except people who purchase Who Gives a Crap. They love putting photos up on Instagram. Why do they do that? Well, it's because these photos literally contain more content than photos of other toilet paper. They don't just say, I'm a toilet paper user in some ways. What they really say is, I'm a conscious consumer. I care about others. I'm part of this cool brand. And so they literally communicate more. There's more content in these images than there would be in equivalent brands. And so the final question, not just why this is happening, but why we need it to happen, is because as we contemplate some of these great issues, these great challenges of our time, like the Sustainable Development Goals, the truth is right now we're not on track. There was a halfway report last year. We're halfway through past that now on the 15 years we gave ourselves, and we're only on track for about 12, 13% of the indicators. And the fact is we just can't get there without business. It's not possible for the government and nonprofit sectors alone to create this future. This has to involve business. Business is more than half of everything that washes through our society in terms of flows of effort, money, information. And it's the only way that we can achieve goals like this. If we talk about zero hunger, all that food is not going to be made by governments and nonprofits. If we talk about good health and well-being, all those medical services, medical breakthroughs, innovations, it's not going to entirely be created by nonprofits and governments. If we talk about decent work and economic growth, it's not going to be nonprofits and governments creating all those decent jobs. It has to be business. And so these are not only the great needs of our time, they're also some of the great business opportunities for entrepreneurially minded people. It's how we can build business as a delivery mechanism that helps achieve these goals, but in a way that also satisfies what we need, whether that's employment or wealth creation, that's up to you. But what's important to understand is that we can do these things together. In fact, we must. So where are we? Big picture, I'll leave you with. This is my thoughts on the trajectory of social enterprise in our society. I think there's 4 phases. The first is the niche. And that, to be clear, has almost always existed. As people have to say, social enterprise isn't new. And it's true, it's not new. There's been organic shops and fair trade shops and secondhand shops and various types of ethical and community-owned cooperatives for a very long time. Depending on which literature you read or whose report, marketing agencies love to break people into different consumer groups. And pretty much as long as kind of consumer segmentation has existed, there's always been an ethical consumer. But it was a niche. They were a niche within the consumer group. And what that looked like was usually having to go out of your way. My wife and I used to shop at Taste Organic here in Sydney, and it was a purely organic. It was a social enterprise supermarket. And it was small and it was expensive and it was out of the way and we couldn't do our whole shop there. So it did involve a certain amount of sacrifice, a certain amount of hassle and expense. And that was typical for what I call for people who are operating that niche. That niche, not always, depends, something like local co-ops, a bit of a different vibe, but in general, it was often a bit more premium. It certainly required people with a higher motivation. And so that's what I call social enterprise. The second is what I call competitive advantage. That is brands that are intentionally taking on the mainstream market. They're not content with that niche. They're not trying to compete in that niche. They're trying to actually compete with the other 85% of the economy, the mainstream. And what that looks like is increasingly the presence of various social enterprise brands in mainstream spaces. So now, more often than not, we can go to, say, Woolworths, and we'll still be able to buy social enterprise products there, like Bread and Butter Project, a great bakery social enterprise in Sydney that employs refugees. And even as, this photo shows, the pricing will be on par, the location is on par. So they're winning at quality with the other factors that go into a decision, convenience, price, etc. So now social enterprises are out there showing, working hard to be as convenient and as price competitive as their competitors, but also better for the world. And so I think, if you can win your way to parity on those other things, we go from 15% of the market willing to pay more, go out of their way, generally make more effort, to I think 85% of the market is willing to take that deal if it's right there in front of them, and they essentially get better for the world as a bonus or as a differentiator. If it's the same price, same location, I think 85% of people, when presented with that choice, will make the right one. The third is what I call systemic advantage. And that is not just competing in the current business as usual. That's some kind of changes to the game itself. So that's generally legislation. That's shifting some of the government subsidies, laws, bringing in mandates, etc. That shifts our economy in a more sustainable direction. Banning plastic bags, putting a price on carbon, moving subsidies from oil, gas, fossil resources through to renewable resources. It's why generally when people ask me, what can the government best do to support social enterprise? I think the answer you get from a lot of people in the sector is things that are specifically for social enterprise, more grants, maybe a social enterprise certification or legal registration, etc. I think the most valuable things government can do is just shift the whole economy, do the things only the government can do. Philanthropists and investors can put in capital potentially, but no one but government can actually shift big picture, some of these rules of the game, where the big picture subsidies and so on go. And once they do, of course, then the people who've already put the work in, they already measure their positive and their negative outcomes and try and balance those, or obviously end up on the positive side of the ledger. So they're ready for that future. And then finally, once that emerges, what will happen is it'll become the new norm. And we actually won't need a phrase social enterprise anymore. It'll just become the new standard that we consider, this is just what it is to be a business. This is the social right to operate. Of course, businesses have to think about their wider stakeholders. It'll seem crazy. I genuinely believe it'll seem crazy that at some point, the whole idea that businesses were not accountable to and had no role to play, to anyone other than shareholders, I think will seem, comically absurd. And so in terms of where we are now, I think we're mostly here. It changes a little bit by sector. Some sectors are, of course, a lot more mature and some are way earlier on still, probably still very much in the niche. But I think what we see increasingly is like the bread and butter project in Woolworths, like the rise of category by category. We're seeing great social enterprises taking on mainstream businesses. And then we're seeing entire categories emerge, like clean tech, circular economy, slow fashion, and so on, where the entire definition of the category rests on a social impact model or belief. And there's just huge opportunities in there that are going increasingly mainstream. And this is often led by entrepreneurs who are leveraging their social story to create competitive advantage. Those competitive advantages include some where people may be willing to pay more, or more commonly, they're willing to share that marketing competitive advantage we touched on before. You have a recruitment competitive advantage. More and more young people, as we saw, want to work for companies that have a clear social mission, want to be part of that so you can get the best talent and keep them the most motivated. They'll work harder and do more creative, inspirational work if they're inspired to be part of something that's bigger than just making a profit for a shareholder. Depending on how optimistic or negative you might currently feel about the future, and gosh knows the last week or so has certainly led to some possibly more gloomy thoughts. But if you believe that we're going to reach that systemic advantage, and I truly do believe that that's a when, not an if, that these policies will change, that we will price pollution and not employment, for instance. We'll tax the things we don't want rather than things we do want. Putting a price on carbon would just be the first of putting a price on other forms of pollution and things that we don't want, and encouraging the things we do want. That systemic advantage will arise. And at that point, suddenly the whole world will shift in our direction, and that will advantage the people who are ready. And that means doing the hard work now to invent those models that even if someone did apply a tax on pollution, would still make sense because you've designed in a way that minimizes that pollution and maximizes that positive impact. Right now, that is hard, to get those things right because we do live in the business as usual world. But when those systemic rules change, it's going to be like having a crystal ball and knowing that the fuel shock was coming in 73. I think it's a great example of a segment of an industry going from competitive advantage to systemic advantage. And that was Japanese automakers. They'd made the world's fuel efficient cars, but only for their local niche, really, in order to win market share in Japan, where it's the most expensive land on Earth, the highest density in Tokyo needed small cars need more efficient engines. It wasn't that they were kind of environmentally focused per se, or even fuel consumption focused as an end in itself. It was rather space. But then the fuel shock in 73 happened, the cost of petrol ballooned, and suddenly people almost everywhere were at least considering fuel efficiency as a key decision-making factor. Some people just love muscle cars. Some people, there are other things that go into it. Look, feel, brand, all of that still matters. But the difference was that now fuel economy was suddenly, and I think forever, on that list of consideration for a majority of people. Had become a mainstream thing to think about when buying a car. And that suddenly created a systemic advantage for the Japanese car makers at that time. West Australia just banned plastic bags. And of course, it's the social enterprises that were already building that post-plastic future that are most poised and ready, we hope. Sometimes business as usual steps in when the opportunity is rife, but it's why we need courageous social entrepreneurs to build these companies of the future now. It's the kind of work that we do at Start Some Good. And so as I said before, the reason that, I'm at my heart not a business person, I'm a change maker, I'm a social entrepreneur. I've founded multiple nonprofits and for-profits. The reason that I've ended up in the social enterprise space, both founding social enterprises and helping other people found them and launch them, is because I think it's incredibly exciting that we can use business to create the future we want. I didn't know that when I was growing up. I thought it was one or the other, that only nonprofits and government could lead social change. And so knowing that we can use the incredible tool that business is to invent, to create value, to move that value around, to motivate people to participate, it's a very powerful tool set. But actually, more to the point, I think we must use business to create the future we want. It's only through using business in the right way, reimagining business, the entire economy, that we're actually going to create that future that we sure all desire, one that is more fair, just, connected, and sustainable. As it helped more people do that, Start Some Good began life as a crowdfunding platform, specifically focused on that challenge of raising first funds and launching. Still do that. That's still a big challenge. A few years ago, we took a step backwards, realized people needed more help really thinking through their idea and turning it into something that was ready to launch. So we launched the Good Hustle, which is a 10-week program that turns an idea into a plan. If you have a bit of a light bulb moment, really helps you get meat on those bones, getting clarity around your impact model, your business model, your, what kind of funding might exist out there for you, your pathway to market, and so on. The final thing that I was asked to share with you all, thank you for spending this time with me, and for those watching the video afterwards, thank you for making it all the way to the end. So this is the next session coming up in this webinar series with Kerry McCallum, the Director of News and Media Research Center at University of California.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was so interesting. So there's a lot to cover, but it was excellent. It was excellent. As he said, the next webinar will be with Kerry McCallum, who's the Director of the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra on the 11th of December. Does anyone have any questions to end off this session?
Digesting. I think like to imagine I just kind of comprehensively covered everything. No questions left. But if anyone does have any questions, I would just encourage you, please, reach out, connect with me on social media. I'm most kind of responsive, interactive, and I guess present on LinkedIn. If you look me up, I'm probably the top Tom Dawkins, I'd like to believe, for most people here who might be searching me. But if not, I'm the one who founded Startsandgood and Lens Are Good. So get in touch if there's anything I can do to help. And of course, startsandgood.com for all of our suite of services and supports.